Yes, my name's Mark. I'm one of the side rangers based at Risley Moss, working for Warrington Borough Council. There's 2 rangers based there, my colleague in Kerry also. And we've worked closely with Natural England since 2007 to face some of the difficulties that we've encountered at Risley Moss. And we've prepared this little presentation, I say little, 61 slides, I think, historical rewilding. And as Helen says, that's a very good point, Helen. It's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but lots of people have been doing this work for many years. And even now, rewilding is a term that they're trying to drop because you get contradictory messages between farmers and conservationists. And really, in some respects, we need to work together, be on the same sort of. And Paul's going to steer the presentation, and we're going to share some notes together. Shall we go, Paul?
Yeah, I'll put it on now. Here we go. You see that?
Okay, there we go. Historical rewilding, Risley Moss. Yeah, got it. So in the foreground, though, you've got the mini moss, and in the background, the main mossland. You can see the woodland in between, a large portion of it, which is wet woodland, which acts as a lag fen for the main mossland area, but they're all linked. And I think we're going to go over to Paul, really, because we're going to go through the history shortly of how Risley Moss came about and damage. But let's go through historically the formation of bogs, and there's no better than Paul, who's an expert on this. So I'm going to pass over to you, Paul.
Righto. So I think the starting point of when you're trying to sort of rewild, or I suppose restore a habitat, is to actually understand what you're trying to do, what the thing is, and you know there are lots of different names associated with wetland types. You know, locally in Cheshire, Lancashire, we tend to have lots of places that have got moss in the name. Mossland tends to be the local name, but that's actually referring to a number of different habitat types. In Cheshire, they tend to be basin mires, and as you move further north and the rainfall increases, it tends to move more towards lowland raised bog in the lowlands anyway. So it's really important to understand what it is we're actually trying to restore, what the community is in terms of the plants and the sort of proportions of them, the species that should be there, and we can kind of tease out that and understand in degraded habitats by looking kind of back at what was there in the past and the process that the site went through to develop and grow in the first place. So it's kind of important to understand where the site came from before we sort of embark on trying to sort of fix it, as it were. Other thing to bear in mind is that, you know, habitats are not sort of static things. They don't just sit there. I think in the past, particularly if you go back to the sort of predecessors of Natural England, the Nature Conservancy Council, where the first SSSIs were developed, it was almost like these were kind of meant to be almost museum examples of these habitat types, the best examples in the country, and we protect them and put them in boxes, as it were. But I think there's more of an understanding now that habitats function and develop and a part of a wider landscape as well. So we kind of need to take all of those things into consideration when we're looking at sort of restoring sites and bringing back lost habitats and degraded habitats. So that's just sort of a bit of but setting the scene really there of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve. So when you get to Risley, it's, you know, if you're looking at a textbook about how bogs develop, or lowland raised bogs develop, you see this sort of hydrosear succession where you start off with a sort of a lake or open water, and it sort of gradually over time fills in with vegetation, and because that vegetation is waterlogged, it doesn't decay, and then that's how you get peat start to develop. One of the key sort of features, and I think it's going to be a thread that goes through the whole talk, is that this group of mosses called sphagnum mosses, or sort of bog mosses in sort of common English name. There's a number of species and we see on these sites, but they all have something in common, which is they are ecosystem engineers. They build their own habitat, they maintain it. They're really important for the function of bogs. They're where the origin of bogs came from, and they're what forms the peat and basically causes them to grow. So this species is the key species, and it's obviously very water dependent, and it is basically the whole aim of what we're trying to do in this habitat is to get the sphagnum back so it can do the work for us, then restoring the habitat. Sphagnum moss is so good at forming peat that in the case of Risley moss, it kind of maybe originally followed the sort of textbook hydrosia from lake to sort of fen through to bog formation, but the area was so wet and the sphagnum grew so much that it kind of engulfed small hills and kind of blanketed the whole landscape in a process called palification. This occurred about 5,000 years ago. So you can imagine before that this area is kind of it's the Mersey Valley. So you've got at the end of the Ice Age, you've got sort of quite large deposits of sort of sands and gravels and till deposits deposited all over the place. Bits of ice blocking rivers up and things. So the area is getting really waterlogged. So you've got the perfect conditions for the very start of these bogs to develop. You know, that's the origin of the peatlands we see in the area still to this day. So what if we could travel back in time and sort of slice Risley moss in half like a big cake? This is kind of the cross section we would look at. We're seeing the kind of anatomy of a bog here. So you can see we've got a dome structure. So that's kind of, it's almost like you imagine a teardrop or a droplet of water. It's got that sort of surface tension that allows it to be domed. It's a sort of similar thing on a much larger scale with a bog. It's kind of that shape because that it hydrologically allows the water table to be perched and perched up above the level of the land around it and above the land level of the groundwater. So the only rainfall that's keeping that top surface of the mire expanse or the top of the dome wet is from rainfall, and that means that the system is ombrotrophic. You can see that as it slopes down, it kind of goes into these areas called lag fens. Now these are in connection with the groundwater and are really important as they're kind of, if you imagine the water on the top of the dome as like traffic, and it's flowing off the dome and away. Well, the lag fen's like a sort of traffic jam which stops the water and slows it down going up the slope and keeping it perched on top. So those areas around the bog are really important for the hydrological function. So we've got a number of things here. We've got the sphagnum moss, which is helping to regulate the moss. So you've got a living layer of sphagnum which can be up to 0.5 meter thick over the surface of the moss, which is called the acrotelm, and then you've got the peat mass underneath, which is supporting it and doesn't allow water through, which is called the catatelm. So these layers that's sort of built up a meter every 1,000 years as the bog develops. The mosses on the sort of in this area probably would have been about 7 to 8 meters deep. In the deepest bits of chat moss, you still to this day get sort of 10 meters of peat in some areas. So these systems can build up to a lot of carbon stored in them and build up way above the land around them, hence the name lowland raised bog. So I think this is important sort of picture really, because it's showing what we're trying to get back to. And I suppose that the process of how that we got from this to what we see today is just as important to understand when we think about what we need to do to fix it. So I'll move forward then. Do you want me to talk about the history of it, or do you want to go through that, Mark?
If the historical degradation, well, we've got quite a number of processes which occurred for that, really. If you want to take the first bit, Paul, and I'll take some of the direct things that affected Risley. I mean, yeah, the list on the left here, you can see, take it from 1736 where the estate was bought by John Ireland Blackburn on the death of Elizabeth Risley, the family who owned it for a couple of centuries. Moving on to 1853, where Richard Dewhurst purchased the estate and the oak ash woodland, which is in between the main mossland and the mini moss. That was planted up round about then, and some of it still stands now, obviously. Some of the estate, this is when a lot of the degradation started. In 1872, part of the estate leased to Risley Peat and Miss Moss Litter Company. So, of course, the cutting of peat is one of the first things that starts. You may get drainage around the site because of agriculture encroaching upon it. Obviously, the Chat Moss system and Holcroft Moss, Pestilong Moss, the whole area would have been bogged, but obviously areas were drained for agriculture. Risley Moss was too wet, but they did start to cut peat, which of course means you have to cut drains. So to get the water off, you cut great big drains or grips in there to take the water off so you can work it, and that starts the process of the degradation. And leading to that as well, 1872, 1873, you've got the Manchester to Liverpool section of the Cheshire lines being built, which separated Risley Moss from Wilson Moss, Rixton Moss. I don't know if any of those elements you want to add to, Paul, or just carry on working through them.
Yeah, I was just going to say about the railways. It was a real kind of step change in the destruction of the mosses when the railways came in. It meant that they could get the peat out to the growing towns of Liverpool, well, cities of Liverpool and Manchester either side. It was used for horse bedding, wasn't it? I think originally. But also they could get night soil in, which is basically a mixture of ash and Victorian sewage, back out to convert the mossland to productive farmland. So there's accounts at the time of the sort of different estates that own the various mosses begging the railway companies for sidings on their land, because then they could open up these formerly areas that were deemed to be kind of useless and just wastelands as mossland, and convert them. So it was, there was social change and sort of industrial and technological change that was happening across society that was kind of driving this massive loss in habitat that, sort of 1840s onwards, really. Yeah,
so coming from that, they're mentioning all that, Paul, the farmland in the Rixton area was renowned for some of its fine vegetables and salad stuffs. It was giant celery. So because of the work that they'd done there, it became more and more productive, and became of such a high standard, it was sent down to Covent Garden. So that sort of work there, obviously not great for Risley Moss, because you've got all that going, that drainage on the other side. The commercial peat cutting, Risley Moss ceased in 1928. So based on all that carbon being locked in there, as soon as the drainage starts, that's one of the things we'll go on to about when we say rewilding. We consider it as repair and then restoration, because if you've got a peat mass which is kept wet, which is the first point, and that carbon is still locked in. As soon as that peat mass starts to dry out, you're releasing that carbon. So really, that issue is one of the key things. Before we talk about the bogs continuing to grow, one of the first things you've got to do when repairing it is making sure that water is kept in. So all those drains that were engineered into the site to drain it, you sort of reverse engineer it from a simple level. So the commercial peat cutting stopped. However, all of those drains would have still been working. They'd have been draining the site continuously. The factory continued to process peat from elsewhere. So that land would then have just laid as it was on its own, probably people stealing a bit of peat for fuel, a bit of poaching down there, various aspects going on site. The area surrounded by farmland is a section of Risley Moss, which was farmland, until, of course, in 1939, when the War Ministry turned round to the local farmers and landowners and said, you have 2 to 3 weeks to clear the land. We're going to build Risley Ordnance Factory. Because, of course, World War II was upon us. An area like Risley Moss was chosen because you've got bog with surrounding farms in a quiet area, so you get lots of mists. So any reconnaissance aircraft flying over, if the area was blacked out, you won't be able to see that a bomb factory was there. So that began there, and the ordnance factory was built across the road, which is now gorse covert and oakwood. And Risley Moss was used for testing of small munitions, smoke bombs, and for dumping of boiler clinker and various other nasty heavy metals around sites. It's a bit of a dumping ground, really, and a test ground. And so that's sort of the history of that. Now, that, of course, finished in 1945, and the area was used by the Admiralty as a store, all the buildings across the way. You can see the top picture on the right there. That's the bomb factory. In the bottom right-hand corner is Risley Moss. You'll see there was 30,000 people at max working on site there. It was a bomb stuffing factory. So all kinds of munitions stored there. You can see that one of the bunkers, section of the bunkers there, one of the photographs, just above the peat cutters. That continued and that remained. You'll see on that bottom right-hand photograph, there's a white square right in the middle. That's blacked out. That was, well, it's completely blanked out. That's where they used to do some of the testing from. So there was a tram line going in there. Tram lines came from across from the other side into Risley Moss along that area there. Anything to add to that, Paul?
Yeah, I'll just say that all this history and all these maps and old photos and all these things were important bits of evidence we used. So every one of those little tracks that the bomb factory put in, the locations of the fields all tell us where there's drainage that we need to consider when we're planning our restoration. So all of this information is really relevant to what we did and how we did it. So yeah, that's all. I'll move us on to the next slide.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say about the fire break ditches on the site. So during the sort of the 70s and the sort of developments of the new town, and they were looking at restoring the moss, there was a real risk and worry of basically the site was covered in purple moorgrass, Malinia, which is a deciduous grass. I think it's our only deciduous grass that basically drops its leaves and forms this lovely sort of flammable thatch, and it builds up over the years. So it's quite a good environment for propagating wildfires. So there was a real worry that all the new houses that were being built around the moss would be at risk from the wildfires on the moss. It was a traditional management on these mosses to keep them open for peat cutting, that they would be burned every year. So they constructed these huge sort of 10-meter wide fire breaks around the site, which also is a real significant thing that we had to deal with when we came to restoring the site. And it was understanding what was done with these that was also an important factor when we came to the restoration. Is actually a lot bigger and more effective drainage than any of the peat cutting did on the site. So this gets us up to the more recent history in terms of the sort of, yeah, we're talking about conservation history now rather than sort of destruction, I suppose.
Well, we are, but actually 1978 was when the first phase of the repair started, with the first sluices and dams being put in to re-wet the area. Yeah. So 1978 when that started, and 1980 when it opened, and then Cheshire taking over at 1984, and then the first designation of SSSI, obviously recognise the importance of a lowland raised peat bog. That SSSI designation still in place, of course, and then the site was threatened with closure in 1990, and this is important because we have a very active friends group, REMAG, Risley Moss Action Group, And actually, it was the Moss Action Group and various other groups who all got together to save Risley Moss from closure. So that's a key part of Risley Moss's history, the involvement of local people to actually save the site. And then one of them did a master stroke and brought David Bellamy along to a council meeting, who at the time was quite famous on TV. So I think they backed down and said, probably not a good idea if we close Risley Moss. So that's where we're at with that. Yeah, and then we took over in 1994. There was the first phase of bog recontouring. I'm not sure if that was the bunds and scrapes right back in the day, Paul. Yeah, so the bunds and scrapes, which is effectively scraping areas and putting bunds in to cut off the grips or the drainage. Unfortunately, when that was carried out, the plans might have been in place, but the actual bunds are not bunds, and they don't actually block grips. It's actually peat sap on top of purple moorgrass in many areas. So that's a bit of an issue that we had to face going through. Warrington Ranger took over in 1998, and we've been dedicated to continuing its repair since. And there's been a few phases of re-wetting since then. And 2005, another key aspect, special area conservation of the Manchester Mosses. In 2011, this was a really key one to protect the site. It was the higher level stewardship driven along by Paul's involvement from Natural England. Do you want to say more on that, Paul?
Yeah, so I'm going to do a section on the designated site stuff. So I'll touch on that as we get to the end of that, I think.
Okay, doke.
So I'll just talk about the SSSI and the SAC. So you know, I started off by talking about what Risley Moss is, and that's a really important part of why SSSIs and how SSSIs are notified. So they have to meet certain criteria. The J and CC basically produce a big thick volume which lists all the habitats, geological features and species criteria for the selection of SSSIs. So Risley Moss had to meet the lowland raised bog criteria to qualify as a SSSI lowland raised bog, and the boundaries are set. There's also the SAC, which is the Special Area of Conservation, which recognises the site as obviously most of our lowland raised bogs are degraded now because they've all been sort of cut over and drained and damaged in the past. We've got 8% or something that's in a semi-natural state in England, so it's not a massive amount. So it recognises the SAC that the site is degraded but is capable of restoration within 30 years. And I suppose that as the site started restoration, that 30-year clock is now ticking, as it were. So when I took the site on in 2007, it was kind of really imperative that we kind of got things right and got the site on track to try and meet that sort of 30-year target for the restoration of the site. You'll notice on the sort of boundary map there, which is the brown area which sits around the site is the peat mass. So you can see we've not got a whole peat bog. We've got a sort of a relic fragment of a peat bog. So that has complications and consequences in terms of hydrology as well. So it's always good to have the whole peat mass if you're trying to manage a peat body. But obviously there's things like birch wood and the farmland around it which have truncated that peat mass, and there is external drainage which is also a factor. So in terms of what we want to see on a SSSI, that is basically set out. Each site has a document called, it's basically the definitions of favourable condition. And this goes through basically the species we want to see on the site and the species we don't want to see on the site in terms of negative indicators. And as I was saying earlier on, sphagnum's a big one on lowland raised bogs. It's the key species for the site. So you'll see here there's certain species listed which are the lowland raised bog specialist sphagnums, things like Sphagnum papillosum. These are key bog building species. These are the species that form peat and were responsible historically for the growth of the mosses in the first place. So that's reflected in the targets we have for the site. We're expected to see 20% cover a minimum of sphagnum mosses. There's also positive indicator species that you need to see as part of that community as well. So things like cross-leaved heath, cranberry, the cotton grasses, horsetail and common cotton grass. So all these species make up the community, and they're the things that we're looking for when we're monitoring these sites. And basically what we're trying to, it sets out a definition of what we're actually trying to achieve with the management and the restoration work we're doing. We're trying to get to meet these targets. There's also the positive indicators and indicators of quality. There's some quite sensitive species like the sundews, the bog rosemaries. So these are things that tell us that the site is in really good condition. There's things that tell us there's things wrong as well. For instance, encroachment of scrub is telling us there's issues with drying out. So we have targets for scrub. There are indicators of nutrient enrichments, things like common reed and typha, reed mace, which are telling us that maybe the acidity the site's not as acidic as it needs to be, or there is nutrient enrichment coming in. So these are all things we're looking for in terms of the site. And these are all indicators which tell us, it's almost a way of diagnosing what's wrong with the site. If it was a patient, they'd be the symptoms of the disease, these things. So they're the kind of things that give us clues to about what actions we need to take to sort of restore the site as well. So it's just important, really, one of the key factors and one of the key drivers in the destruction of all the mosses is drainage. And it's kind of really important to understand what drainage does and how it makes us not meet those targets I've just talked about. So water level is critical, particularly for sphagnum mosses. The sphagnum, under normal conditions, this active layer of 50 centimeters deep over the surface normally contains all of the kind of the active water on a bog, I suppose is a good way of putting it, all the water that's kind of doing something biologically in terms of the community growing at the surface. And that layer protects the peat underneath. And that's the first thing to go when you cut peat, because that's scraped off and it's lost due to the peat cutting. So as you dig your drains deeper and deeper and you draw the water table down, you start to get this sort of greater and greater effect. So as you drop below 10 centimeters below the surface, you start to lose your sphagnum mosses. You get deeper down, you're losing a lot of the cotton grasses and the sort of things like sundews and things like that that are really sensitive. You're losing your sort of key indicators of positive change in terms of a mossland, and you start to gain negative indicator species like the purple moorgrass starts to become dominant, and that starts to shade out whatever's left of the sort of good bog species you want to keep, until a stage where you start to get birch, downy birch, and coming in and taking over and starting to turn the site into a woodland eventually. And you can almost plot it out as a sort of chart of doom. As the site dries out, you see this sort of change from your sphagnum dominated community through your Molinia dominated community. Scrub moves in until eventually you find areas of peatland that have been drained and dried out for like 100 years. And it's effectively a woodland. You've got broad buckler fern on the ground, birch trees as the sort of the main sort of tree species in there, but then you start to see oak and things coming in as well. So that's the kind of path. If these sites are just left, they will not remain just as open mosslands if they're not managed. So high level stewardship. So when I first took the site on, we went through the monitoring sort of process, and we found the site very lacking in terms of the positive indicator species and a lot of the negative indicator species in there. And it's not something we can allow to sort of persist in terms of a SSSI and an SAC. So it was imperative that we did something and worked out what the issues were and did something about them. And obviously that requires funding, and the higher level stewardship Currently, the scheme's called Countryside Stewardship, but that was a mechanism to get money to the site and to pay for capital works to address the issues that were present on site. So I don't know, Mark, do you want to talk now about what we actually did?
Yeah, that was quite a lot of stuff to take in there, lots of science, but it's basically all that leads to what we're going to do about it, because that's the important bit. Yeah, it's been damaged. That's what we've got. If we allow it to continue to be damaged, it's releasing carbon. Species that should be on there, they're not going to find it back. What we've got to remember is what we need to do is actually let the habitat care for itself. We need to get the condition back for the habitat to care for itself. Sort out on a bog, which is what it is, we need to sort out the hydrology. So we spent a lot of time going around looking, find the leaks off site. The red ones are some of the leaks, and the blue ones are some of the overflows that were put in to try and control the water flow across the mossland. Unfortunately, a lot of those overflows were actually completely switched off, so the water was completely flowing off site. So step number one was to turn all those up and try and retain the water, really. The other leaks are from historical drainage and peat cracking after it's been dried out. So that map there took around about three years to work together to try and come up with a system. When I first spoke to Paul and did his first tour, he went whiter and paler as we walked around the site. And I asked what he thought of the condition and needed the clean version. So he provided that, and basically it was unfavourable declining, which is not what we wanted. We need to get back to unfavourable recovering. Some people think you can get to favourable, but you can't, because that'd be untouched. So that's where we got there with all the ditches, the bunds and the leaks. Anything to add to that, Paul?
No, I think that's kind of covered it, really. It was, we basically went through all of that history stuff to track down where all those leaks was. And I think we ended up basically walking around with ranging poles, poking holes in the ground to find pipes underground at the very end of it to sort of pin that down. Yeah. And supporting that, we used a lot of sort of online resources, like there's the BGS, the British Geological Society, have got borehole and hydrological maps. So all of this information we kind of had to pull together to sort of build that model of how the site was leaking, where it was leaking, and to work out where we needed to make interventions to sort it out. So everything from borehole logs to archaeological surveys, every possible source of information, we trolled it. Old 70s aerial photographs, 1940s aerial photographs, whatever we could get our hands on, basically, to work out where there were drainage.
Ah, the metal piling dams.
Yeah.
You want to take this on me?
Yeah, well, a lot of the original restoration that was done on starting in the 70s, they had the right idea, keep the water on the site. Unfortunately, they probably went for the product that was available at the time, which was metal sheet piling, which in a very acidic environment probably wasn't the best choice. But I suppose there was nothing else at the time. They didn't have plastic piles like we do now, so it was what they had to work with.
Yeah, I think going back to that slide, Paul, if you take it back to that one, because that there is obviously that is that they realised that the fire break ditch wasn't necessarily a good idea, as it was draining the bog. So they needed to block it. So they had to put dams in to block it, because if you put a ditch in a wetland and it starts to fill immediately and starts to run off site, it's an issue. Well, that was their first attempt to stop it. Like I say, we didn't have the material. Go on to the next slide, mate. Yeah.
This is the first thing we did, isn't it?
That's for the first dams, yeah. We walked down towards the end of the fire break ditch. It didn't look like it was flowing very much, but actually that means underneath it was flowing quite a lot. It's quite surprising, and there's various theories why, but at the end of the fire break ditch, there was a 2-foot high pipe, 3-foot diameter pipe, which normally you wouldn't need if you were just holding water on a mossland. I understand the fire break ditch, but I can't understand why you want to let it off. Potentially, at the time it was about to be sold off, there was rumours that they might want to create a landfill somewhere in that area. And if a bog was damaged, then that'd be a beautiful landfill, wouldn't it? That didn't happen because of support from REMAG and people saying, no, this is an important site. And that there is a landfill in Rixton, which is a bit of a site away from the main mossland. That's one of the first dams we repaired. Right in the, dug it out, ripped out the metal piling, or actually built at the back of the metal piling, put plastic piles in and seal it. And immediately that fire break ditch started to fill overnight. An indicator of how much water was coming off the mossland.
Yeah, the fire break ditch was virtually, there was just a bit of mud at the bottom, wasn't it? It didn't have any water. We went from that to about 1.5 meters deep in water behind it.
Yeah.
So it was a massive amount of water that was just leaking out through that. And that sort of basically sliced through the whole peat mass of the site and was all linked together. So that was a really key location. I suppose it's why we did, it was the first thing we did, because without that, nothing else on the site we did would have made any difference.
Well, that indicated how much we're losing. And if we attack the other areas, then we might get similar result, yeah.
And that's the dam after...
Actually, that's one that we put in by hand, unbelievably.
Yeah, it's further downstream, is it?
Yeah, that was quite a number of years ago. It certainly won't be doing that now, because we had to hand carry those piles into the woodland from the path, stand up to our waists in slop and swing hammers at those to drive them in. But they've been very effective, yeah. It's been amazingly effective and still operational now. That whole water table backing up from there increased massively from that.
It's quite good because we were able to sort of a series of those dams, sort of stacking the water up, basically almost recreating that sort of slope up the dome to put the water back on the main. We're not even on the mossland here, we're in the sort of woodlands around it, but it's just as important to get those areas wet to support the mossland that's adjacent. So yeah, it was a really key bit of work, that. Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't be doing it nowadays. I was much younger in them days.
Snap.
So we're kind of out on the main moss now. So this part of our investigations, we were finding sort of these pipes that were turned completely off so that the water could just flow freely out. But we're also finding cracks and buried underground drains as well, which were kind of bypassing everything and letting water out of the site. So we had some real issues in terms of basically the effect of external drainage was being sort of amplified and taken right into the heart of the site by these cracks and old buried drains that you couldn't see from the surface. You had to really sort of poke around to find them. So that was a real kind of next step in terms of this was the second phase of re-wetting we did under countryside stewardship, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you know, the effect of that when we put those piles in, that's the area kind of all brackeny and covered in scrub before the works, and that's the piles going in there with a machine. And as the piles were being put in and the bunds put in to hold the water into the site, the water was actually rising around the digger as it was working. Yeah,
you've got to make sure with the digger that you go in the right direction, otherwise you're stuck. But that point there, that's a key area there, because that's directly adjacent to the main outlet pipe. So we raised the main outlet pipe by 1.5 meters and put a new bund in. So effectively, across the whole of the main mossland, the water level was raised by 1.5 meters. So that's how effective some of that work was and how important it was, because that meant that with all the controls held and the extra bunding and the pipes blocked, the actual peat mass could rehydrate, which it started doing quite quickly.
Yeah, we noticed it in that area. There was about a 0.5 meter rebound in the peat surface after it kind of took the water up. So it just shows you kind of the effect of doing this work and how it's kind of basically restoring the underpinning environment, which will eventually support the lowland raised bog community. But you need to get that environment fixed and repaired before it can start to repair. And before this there've been years of sort of control of scrub and sort of treating the symptoms of the disease rather than the underlying disease. And it's kind of the kind of really got to the bottom of why the site was still leaking. And that's the effect afterwards. That was a couple of days later, that first photo there, wasn't it? It just shows you how much water we were losing.
Yeah. Quite effective.
Yeah.
Well,
and you can see the bright green patches on that second photo. That's Sphagnum Moss already starting to come in. That was the summer after the works, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. There's lots of sphagnum carpet in there, but also because of some of the disturbance, lots of reed bed, and actually that's an excellent spot for waterfall. Yeah. A lot of the work we do, we're not just thinking, right, it's a peat bog, let's protect the peat, let's get that growing. There's lots of species that are involved with it, which we have to take into consideration. That area there, we actually run lots of citizen science courses in that area because there's lots of waterfall signs. So that's another key part of doing this work, is the protected species, and areas like that. Obviously, mink prefer straight lines. You've got a solid bowl of reed bed there, so waterfalls can stop with asking. So yeah, that's another positive indicator of that.
That's what we got at the end, wasn't it? Basically, we blocked off all the leaks. We had control over the water levels, and then the community was able to do the rest for us. We basically fixed the water, the bog plants and the sphagnum and the cotton grass and things like that then start to recover and sort of take over the job for you. So that was kind of the model then we took to the rest of the site, basically, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes the model works and sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes you put a bund in and go, right, that worked then. So we'll put this little bund here and this piling, and this water's going to start building up at the back, and you come back the day after, it's on the other side. So it's like, all right, a bit of scratching of heads, but obviously some of the drainage, it works in different ways. This was a project that took quite a bit of work. You drafted this up, Paul. You can go through it because you spent hours and hours. It was every day. So since 2007, I got a phone call at 8 o'clock every morning from Paul saying, I've spotted something else. So we sort of carry on working through them to try and solve it. This is 1920s farm drains in a section of woodland.
So yeah, adjacent to the lowland raised bog is an area of sort of scrubby woodland, which is on deep peat and is within the SAC. So it's directly hydrologically connected. So any drains within that land would be drawing water out of the bog. That area before the bomb factory was farmland, and as you can see from these photographs, there's these clay pipe drains which form like a crisscross drain pattern around the whole area. So if you kind of imagine that the woodlands there, underneath it is just this whole network of drains which are drawing water out, which is then pulling water out of the mossland to the side of it. So this is the plan of all the interventions we made to block them up. It's a very difficult environment to work in terms of access, getting materials out there. Just physically digging down to some of these was quite a task. So yeah, it was important, and it shows you that restoring a lowland raised bog is not just about the bog. It's also about the supporting habitats. So if you remember on the plan I did before, where you got the lag fen around the main bog that's kind of supporting the hydrology of the main bog, that's what we were aiming to create in this area adjacent to the moss. So it is, we pull in the drains out, and then that's what we get. We get kind of these wet areas of wet woodland, which are actually starting to get sphagnum growing in them, and that's kind of extending and providing a future area that the moss can actually grow into, as well as supporting the sort of current sort of habitat that's out there as well. So I'll go on. Is there anything you want to say on that section before I go on to the recent monitoring?
No, it's I think we've covered all that, yeah.
So 2007 to 2019, you think that's the main kind of time we were doing the kind of going around the whole moss and basically blocking every leak we could find, sealing the site up. And I think we kind of reached the point where we were quite happy that we got most of the major leaks and got the site holding water by that point.
Yeah.
So during that time, we've been doing monitoring, but we felt that it was quite a good time to do a quite detailed survey and monitoring to get a sort of snapshot of how the site had changed over time. So we basically went through the whole site and applied the condition assessment specifications across the site, the common standards monitoring, and we saw increases in the cover of sphagnum, and notably, there's two things. You normally, when you restore sites like this, you get sphagnums like Sphagnum phallax, Sphagnum cuspidatum, which are your kind of transitional Maya species. They're sort of what you get at the start of the sort of succession back to lowland raised bog. But we started to pick up for the first time things like Sphagnum papillosum, which basically mean that the site is starting to move on from that sort of early sort of aquatic sphagnum stage to a more lowland raised bog stage in the samples for the first time in 2021. We also started getting the overall abundance of sphagnum increasing as well. So we were all the sort of sphagnum positive indicators were moving in a positive direction compared to sort of previous monitoring. So that's telling us that the work and investment we're putting in is actually paying off and delivering what we want it to. We're also picked up on the quality indicators. So you can see, if you move around the screen here, you start off with the sort of where we had cranberry and royal fern, and you can see it started off in 2011. We had like about 3 sort of clumps of cross-leaved heath on the whole site, a couple of small patches of roundleaf sundew, and you can see 2013 it expanded a little bit with the original restoration work. And then you look at the current map where you've got huge swathes of the site now supporting tens of thousands of sundews, cross-leaved heath spreading over the site, cranberry, all these positive species increasing.
Just on that, mate? Paul. Yeah, yep. Just on that one. When I did when I was taking my first tour of Risley Moss, when I first started, there was a single cane in what we now call sundew scrape, and I asked what the cane was, and it said there's a sundew there. So I said that's spark across the site, and just by saying we didn't set out to say, right, this is what's going to happen here. We just sorted out the hydrology, and the bog started looking after itself, and the plants started to do their work, really.
Yeah. It's you provide the physical environment, you get that right, and nature does the rest. And the more that sphagnum moss grows, and the thicker that sort of layer of living moss over the surface, and the more that knits together to form a continuous surface, the more the site will have to will be able to look after itself and be more robust in terms of droughts and things like that. And the fact that the whole peat mass is now saturated gives you that security as well. I think you've noticed that this year with the drought we've had.
Well, yeah, I think that's why we did call it sustainable repair and restoration, because right from the start, we made the decision, if you remember, that what we needed to do was get maximum water into the peat mass for times like these now. So that's why we raised the water level so high to actually saturate the peat, so that when we got drier periods, that peat mass would stay wet, keep the carbon locked in. Yeah. And I've seen that this year. Yeah, it's worked well.
So yeah, there is still a residual problem with Molinia, and I suspect that is largely due to the way the site was cut for peat. You can see it on the aerial photograph there. You've got all these stripes going across the site, and they're the old peat cuttings. So you've got a high ridge called a balk, where they used to stack the peat up to dry, and then you've got a hole next to it where they used to dig the peat out. And as we raise water levels, it tends to be that those low-lying peat cuttings flood first, and the balks tends to stay a little bit drier, so the Molinia can be a bit more persistent on those sections. And it just takes time for the sphagnum in those peat cuts to build up, and we're starting to see now areas where it's starting to bridge across and swallow up the balks. So we're starting to just about lose that patterning, but it'll take a long time for us to lose the Molinia completely. And you know, we always expect to see some Molinia in this community anyway, because it's a natural component. You tend to get it on the hummocks even in pristine bogs, but it's still a negative indicator that, you know, we need to keep an eye on. And it's an indicator of other problems like air pollution as well, but I'll go into that a bit later on. Again, same with trees. They're there because of the truncation, the damage, the peat mass from peat cutting, and the level differences. And the fact that, you know, it's really persistent. It's really hard to kill willow, for instance, and some of the past management, some of the material that was imported to the site has not helped us in terms of some of the trackways on the site. So there is always, until we've got that sort of living layer of sphagnum across the whole site, going to be a requirement to control scrub on the site. It's just a never-ending task that we'll have to do until we reach the point where it can completely look after itself. But it's something we do keep an eye on. But overall, you know, the works we've done through the Countryside Stewardship Agreement have kept the scrub under control and to a level where it's manageable. Because I know when you first started, it was a sort of like a Herculean task to try and get on top of it.
Yeah, the scrub there, I mean, what you got to remember is that when you look at the drone footage, and it's the actual scrub isn't within the sort of what were formerly scrapes and peat cuts. It's on the raised bunds, a lot of it.
Yeah.
So those raised bunds are sort of peat, well, like raised beds, really. So they hold the scrub. Also, when you look for observation area, it makes it look as if it's all the way across, when actually it's in lines.
Yeah. Again, this is another one of the negative indicators, and we can explain why these are where they are. There's a number of patches of common reed, Phragmites australis, on the site, and they are definitely associated with where brick rubble or trackways were constructed. And basically the acid water's flushing through that material that contains lime, and then you get reed beds. And a lot of the restoration work we've been done has been mindful of that, and we've tried to contain that in rich water and guide it away from the more sensitive areas of the site as well. So it's something we've needed to take consideration of, but we've not really seen any changes or increase in those areas. And to be honest, they provide valuable habitat in their own right where they are as well. So they're a part of Risley Moss, but they're a part we need to be cautious of and aware of, so that that contaminated water doesn't affect or threaten any of the really rare or key species for the site. One thing about calcium is that it's lethal to sphagnum moss. You get that in there and it will kill it off. So it's something we need to be aware of. And that's basically the result of all the hard work we've been doing. We're starting to see all of that lovely green sphagnum moss there spreading out, and it's starting to push out into those bands of the sort of pale coloured grass on those Molinia purple moorgrass, and it's starting to slowly eat its way across there and join together into this sort of continuous lawn of sphagnum across the site. So we're not there yet, but it's well on its way. That's kind of mine, and that's why we've got unfavourable recovering. There's the other process. Once it's done that, the good sphagnums, the Sphagnum papillosums, the Sphagnum magellanicum, or medium, I think it's called now, has to then come in on top of that and build up even more above the water table and really start the process of bog formation once more. So you want to talk about the mini moss, because this is kind of a multifunctional project that was done in biodiversity, but also about people as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, the mini moss, obviously getting people out onto the mossland. We do tours out on the mossland. We get people on the mossland. It is a restricted area, partly because it's dangerous, partly because we've got protected species and it's easy to damage. There was an area next to the main car park, which was historically called the mini moss, and that's what it looked like. Lots of scattered birch, with the grips still operational, draining out. What they used to do was fill in winter and stay there. Then the frogs would come along, lay the spawn, and then of course no rain, a dry out. You've got that across the whole site there. We saw an opportunity to open that up for education, and also realised that the main drain on the edge of that main mossland of the mini moss was actually draining the main mossland as well. You can see there with the water, what we say about bunding, all showed that cross section there where you need to actually go deep into the ground. It's like an upside down dam because you go deeper into the ground, 2 meters, 1.5 meters, then about 0.5 meter on top to hold that water. It's a peat underneath, which is the key. So that project started in 2010 with the Ranger Service, a number of work days. We got felling licenses because obviously the thing is about peat bog. We've lost 95% of that habitat internationally. And you can't just create it overnight. So what we have, we need to protect and try and repair and restore. And that's how that project started. So opening that up, clearing the mini moss. We did have debates with various people. Somebody requested to know whether the woodland first came or the mossland. And I think Paul pointed out, well, the mossland started 10,000 years ago and the woodland's 25 years old. So we sort of won that debate there. It was for a key reason, because that area now is allowed to develop and is a main protector for the main mossland, which we'll see on some of the later slides, I think. Yeah, you can see that map there. This whole plan really was devised by Paul, a various amount of sketches. So we walked on through it, came up with the plans. On the right-hand side, you can see at the bottom there's a drain. Right, that drain used to just look like local bits of wet mud until we got very wet periods, and then you get a really brown ochre colour flush through, which indicated that something had been flushed through from the main mossland. So we had to sort of say, well, okay, let's track back. And in the middle of some woodland, we found cracked gravel pipe, which had a trickle of water through, and realised that was probably draining the main mossland, and put plastic piling in that dam, which was just a sliver of mud. And overnight it raised 2 foot. So that was how much water we were losing from the main mossland in that area.
I think one of the things that's on there as well is the fact that to raise water levels, we had public access in that area. We had to take that into account and make provision for people to be able to still enjoy the area while we raise the water levels as well. So that's why we put a boardwalk in. So
yeah.
So these are just some photos of the kind of the process underway. Really, it's like a microcosm of what we did across the whole site, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can see on that picture there. There's that kind of raised bank of peat that's kind of snaking around the edge of the picture going towards the digger. That's our main weapon in terms of restoring lowland raised bog. That's a peat bund. It's about 0.5 meter high. It'll shrink down to about maybe 30 centimeters high once it's sort of settled. But that is like the tip of the iceberg. The bund is actually mostly underground. It goes down maybe 2 meters to key in and break through all the cracks and pipes and things that might be underneath. And that's been the key sort of technique. The plastic piling dams are just for particular locations where there's a particular problem and there's a lot of pressure in the water and we need to be able to reinforce it. But the majority of the sort of hydrological restoration and getting the habitat back so it can support the habitat that should be there is done by this technique. And that's kind of what it looked like afterwards.
Yeah, initially you do get these flushes and think, wow, eureka, it's worked. And then 2 days later, all the water's gone. That's because you've effectively got hopefully rainwater or water falling on drier areas and sitting on top. And then they start, like a giant sponge with a crust on, they start to seep in and re-wet the peat mass. So then you sort of disheartened. Paul and I used to look at each other and go, what's happened there? It's not right. Until sort of 8 months, a year later, you'd see the water level rising, realising that sponge was now saturated.
Just shows you as well how much water you're losing. If you look at the other side of that bund there, where the woodland's still there, every time it rains, the water's going straight off there down them drains and into the local river system. Whereas we're now holding it back, so it can only get slowly into the river system. So that's one of the other beautiful things that bogs do. They do slow the flow of water down to river systems and can only help with kind of issues around flooding and things like that as well. But that's just a side really to a lot of the sort of benefits we get. quite nicely shows off the access improvement we did there for the boardwalk as well.
Yeah, well, that access was accessible for all, really. So we can get wheelchair users into the area that we couldn't get in before from the far end. We're hoping to get funding to extend that to the car park. So that would be a next phase of that. That's used extensively for environmental led, that area. Great to get the school children out, local primary schools, witness the bog, and they suddenly realise that they're stood on a great blancmange when you get them to jump up and down, it starts to wobble beneath their feet. But it's actually a great message to get across, because with conservation and all the things that we do, key people to get on board are the young people from primary school. If you get to secondary school, there's too cool for school here, they're not interested. But the primary school are the key ones, and then they regain their interest later. But they're going to be the ones taking our messages forward, really. That's why we do so much environmental ed at Risley Moss.
That kind of takes us right up to date, doesn't it, really, in terms of all we've done?
Yeah. So a lot of work there. So you can see the maps on the bottom. So if people looking back at these slides, you'll see historical maps before 1873, all the areas moss. And then pre-war, so you've got all the farmland. And of course, then the bomb factory. And Risley Moss used for all that work. You can see lots of areas where we did progressive works, extending lots of bunds, recreating them. There was giant fire ditches on the far side. We had to put 2 bunds in place to stop that. And then we actually got a favourable condition area of wet woodland in between, which is now saturated, which of a point was very successful with willow tip for many years. We had 6 pairs, and unfortunately, as has happened across a lot of this area, they've all crashed. Lots of areas have lost the willow tip. Why is it's always been a key thing with those. It's there's lots of other sites which are stuff in the same thing. So ongoing looking into that, I'll have to continue. Really. You can see the main moss isolated.
Oh, don't we go back there? Sorry.
Well, it's all right. It's all right. We can move on. Let's go on to the protected species.
Yeah.
So there's some of the species at Risley Moss. We're actually a very good reptile site. We don't actually over promote the fact that we're a very good reptile site. Historically, across the UK, our take on it is, and I've had feedback from other people way back when, a young guy called Matt, who sites, once they get recognised, people go in there and they're over inquisitive, they start poking around and they start messing up on habitats. And those habitats that were there get lost very quickly. At Risley Moss, we worked on projects, introduced. So because of the work we've done, it's allowed us to reintroduce some species. We've worked with other partners, Northwest Rare Plants Initiative, Josh, and the Great Mantle Wetland Partnership, reintroducing the Great Sundew, and they were doing really well. 11, 12, 15 until this year, and they were all stolen. So they disappeared from sight. And it wasn't some, I don't think crows came along and decided, I'll have that. If I went down one day, I could see these little pockets where they've gone. So we've got one of those left. People, when they hear about adders, like to go out and they don't realise how easy it is to destroy that little micro habitat that's important for them. They'll go around, trample on areas of moor grass and heather and stuff, and that's squashed and it's damaged. However, our population is very healthy, all of the site. Grass snake, not so much at all, really. Not enough food out there for them. And also we've got an abundance of common lizard and an abundance of slow worm. So all these species are well represented at Risley Moss. Great Crested Newt also is abundant across the site. So it's a responsibility of ours to try and make sure that we maintain this habitat, protection and ongoing sort of growth, really. All records that we produce, we do constant surveys, all those records are held with Natural England or at any time that they're needed for any sort of investigation. But yeah, we that population is sort of stabilised and has increased in lots of areas across the whole of the 45 hectares of mossland. Also finding its way, slowworms and common lizard have found their way into the mini moss. Adders have been seen more occasionally in the main pathway areas. And once, I think it was 2 years ago, a lady knocked on the door and said, "Do you have snakes?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, there was one on my patio last night. I thought it was a stick. I was going to pick it up." And the only thing was stopping that moving out to the wider countryside was the main road. So, yeah, it's key. So we work with other partners to sort of investigate that. And anything to add to that, Paul?
I was just going to say that, you know, watervole as well we've got on there. You mentioned it before, but, you know, a lot of the re-wetting work has now created massive areas of new watervole habitat. And part of that's responsible for some of the sort of contaminated areas. We get a lot of rush in some areas where there's water flushing out of those reed bed and contaminated areas, and that's perfect habitat for the watervole. So as you said, you know, it's a good indication of the quality of that, you know, the habitats as a whole, as a wetland, but also it's a good resource for training as well. But I suppose the protected species stuff has been something that we've had to be mindful all the way through the restoration as well. So we've had to do surveys. We've had constant consultations with our species licensing team about the protected species sort of issues, and it's been something that's in our minds all the time when we're planning works as well. So it's always been something that's guided and restricted the way we've worked on the site. So it's just been something we've had to, you know, why we're doing the works in the first place is for the wildlife on the site. And, you know, it's important that we take into account with the way we work as well. So that, you know, that's just a sort of a caveat really on all the work that's gone before, really. Should I go on and talk about the kind of future now in terms of threats?
Oh yeah, let's discuss the future. And things like that. Yeah.
So, you know, the drought we've had this summer is a perfect example of, you know, we have got a changing climate, but also that these peatlands are massively important in terms of our fight against climate change. You know, 3% of the world's land surface is covered in peat, but it holds 25% of the global soil carbon. That's about twice the amount of carbon that's in the world's forests. And if you dry out bogs, even bare peat will be kicking out about 13 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare per year. So what we are doing virtually overnight instantly stops that loss. So there's a really important role of this type of work has got, not just for sort of biodiversity and the wildlife of these sites, but also for wider sort of ecosystem services, natural capital, and benefits to wider society as well. What we're doing as well also makes these sites more robust to cope with, you know, things like wildfires and things like that. You know, if the site is soaking wet, it will not burn, or the parts that do burn will be very restricted by the wetness of the sphagnum and the pools and things around it. So it's something that's a benefit and makes the sites more robust and protects that carbon that's in the peat, which is our big resource for the future, I think. You know, this site, it doesn't exist in isolation. You've got so many factors, natural factors, that determine the type of habitat you get on a site, right? From everything from the climate, which is a key determiner of what the community is on these mosses. Even if you look back in time in the peat cores that go down through them, you get layers of different plant communities which are dominant. You got cotton grass and heather dominated communities, and then sphagnum dominated communities, and they sort of change over a number of times through the history of the site. And that's showing past climate change, where there's been dry periods where the cotton grass and the heather's been dominant, and then wet periods in the past. So that will already play a key role in the future of these sites. And the work we're doing gives the site the best chance to be able to cope with those changes and still provide an environment which will protect that carbon, but also protect the rare species that are present on the site. It's a funny sort of chart here, but this kind of, it's not for lowland river bog, it's for a wet grassland community, but it kind of shows you there's this kind of good area of water table depth where a community can survive. And once that water table at various times of year gets outside that area, you start to go into the red, and you start to see things which will push the community to a different community, whether it be scrub dominated, whether it be woodland or whatever. So this is the kind of thing we're trying to avoid with on the site. We're trying to keep the site within the green band where that community can survive. And because we still have control over the water tables with the water level controls, we can help micromanage that and keep it on track until the site can look after itself. So it's something that we've got some control over, even in the face of sort of droughts and things like that. You know, so as Mark was saying before, we can store water in the winter because we've got bunds and controls on the site. So it's something that gives us a bit of flexibility facing the future where we might get drier summers. Just another thing to bear in mind, and that is that these communities are susceptible to nutrient enrichment. So you add more nutrients to a site, you start to see changes, and you've got this sort of chart there of increasing nutrients. You move away from the bog and you go to more fen and rush dominated communities, and that's what's happened on the site where brick rubble and things like that's been moved in already. But there's every single part of the Manchester Mosses exceeds its critical load for nitrogen from air pollution. So that's a constant thing that we're trying to look at and address in terms of the future of these sites. Is the air quality good enough to support these sites long term, or allow for the recovery of these sites? Because if you think in the past, we never had a lot of the sensitive species because the sites were too dry. Now we're creating an environment that can support them. We need to sort of protect and secure that environment and improve it for the future, so these sites can have the right environmental conditions to grow and thrive. Just sort of final word on this: the site doesn't exist in an island. It's a part of a wider landscape of wetlands, and it plays a role in sort of water balance, carbon balance, and it's getting it to link up into that wider landscape. And that's what we're kind of looking at when we look into the future in terms of nature recovery and trying to work out across the landscape. And that started to happen in this area already in terms of the Great Manchester wetlands and all the work that's been gone on in the past from that to try and link them up and to create this sort of functioning wetland landscape around it. So that's it. This site sits in a much wider sort of setting, and then you've got all the sort of meres and mosses in Cheshire as well. So it's kind of how all this sort of works together to provide all these ecosystem services to society, as well as providing a sort of thriving home for wildlife as well. So that's kind of our kind of long-term vision. And I don't know if you've got any last words on that.
No, I think everyone's clear now. I think I think
we're good on that. Get off my that's the last slide. Then we've made it. yeah,
well done. Yeah. Woo. So that picture on the bottom right there, that's the drone footage of the mossland in February this year. Yeah, and that digger there was doing some work earlier this year where we're creating new pools, potentially for white-faced darter in the long run, potentially not. Susceptible to change. I call them the panda dragonfly because they're not very well adapted, really, are they? Yeah, I think we can move on.
Yep. That's it. I think we're done then. That's it.